Everyone, welcome to our Composting 101 in the Kootenays webinar today. My name is Lori Frankham. I'm the Education Program Coordinator with the Central Kootenay Invasive Species Society. Okay, so before we begin, I just want to go through some housekeeping items. So you will notice as you came into Zoom, you are on mute and your video is off. If you do have any questions, comments, please use the chat box. So if you're new to Zoom, there's a little menu bar either on the top of your page or at the bottom of your page, and there's a little bubble there, and you can type your questions in there. Just bear in mind that there's two settings. Either you're putting a question or comment out to everyone that's on this webinar today, or you could definitely select my name, Lori Frankham. I am the host, and I will be kept private. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available online. So if you're a note taker, by all means, take some notes, but you can also sit back, relax, enjoy the information, and know that this information will be sent to you with an email, as well as a whole bunch of resources that we'll be talking about in the email. In the email as well is going to be a survey. We're always looking for feedback on how we can improve our webinars, what you want to hear about, what you learn, so that we can keep offering all this awesome information online. So it looks like we still have some folks joining us. So before we start, let's go back to the next slide there, Rachel. Sorry, I have someone else driving the PowerPoint here. You want to go back to the previous slide? Yep. So let's leave the housekeeping up for now. Just before we begin, we just want to know a little bit about who's watching this webinar. So you'll see a window pop up with some questions. So we want to know if you currently compost. So you're going to pick yes or no, and then hit submit. So I'll leave this poll open for about 15 more seconds. Most of you have answered. So 10 more seconds here. So I'm going to end the poll. Okay, so it looks like the majority of us are actually currently composting, where some of you are just getting into it. So this is a basic composting 101, so we're happy to see some newbies join us. That's awesome. So the next question we want to ask you is about the PlantWise program. So have you ever heard about the PlantWise program? Yes or no? So we'll leave that open. Okay, so it looks like 90% of you haven't heard about it. So I will quickly touch base about the PlantWise program before we dive into the topic of composting. And the last question we have, we want to know the barriers to composting. So if you don't compost, what is your biggest barrier to starting? Or if you're currently dealing with it, what are some things that you're dealing with some troubleshooting? So attracting wildlife, is it space? Are you feeling like it's a lot of effort? You're not sure how? Other reasons, or you currently compost? So we'll leave that open for about 10 more seconds here. Okay, so it looks like everyone has answered. Okay, so a real mishmash of answers here. Some folks are concerned about wildlife, space. Good to see people that don't think it's very much effort. That's awesome. Not sure how to, so hopefully we'll address that in this email. And then looks like, again, most people do currently compost, which is great. So we'll do the next slide there. Okay, so before I introduce our guest speaker and before we dig into the topic of composting, I just want to talk to you about our organization. So for those of you who haven't heard of CKIS before, it stands for the Central Kootenay Invasive Species Society. We're a nonprofit that was formed in 2005 with a vision to protect our ecosystems and communities from the harmful impacts of invasive species. So we'll do the next slide. Oh, that's okay. So I can just talk about it before the slide comes up. So invasive plants, why are they a problem? Is that they tend to be aggressive, prolific seed producers with really long seed banks, and they lack any natural predators. So they end up overtaking native species population. So as a gardener, I'm assuming a lot of you out there are gardeners who want to compost. They can be a real hassle to deal with because they are hard to eradicate. But the bigger picture, they are the second greatest threat to biodiversity globally because of their ability to outcompete our native plant populations for resources, and this definitely impacts ecosystem health and wildlife habitat, as seen in the middle picture there. That is a photo of some native western painted turtles that sadly knapweed roots got the better of them, and these turtles unfortunately died as a result. In addition, they can have social impacts. So they can impact our food security, our water sources, our recreation opportunities, and also our health. So as shown on the picture of the person with the burn, that's a plant called giant hogweed, and the sap from that plant actually created this burn. So a big impact there on the health. And also there's numerous economic impacts caused by invasive plants. They can raise our taxes, increase our utility bills, lower our property values, and also damage infrastructure, as shown in the picture of the knotweed that's growing through someone's foundation there. So those are the impacts that we're trying to avoid from happening. So we can have the next slide there. This is where the PlantWise program comes into play. So when it comes to invasive species management, prevention is the most effective tool in our toolbox. And how we accomplish this is through education and outreach programs like our PlantWise program. So this program was developed because the horticulture industry was identified as a key pathway for the introduction of spread of invasive plants. So as a gardener, here are just some simple tips that you can do to help prevent the spread of invasive species. So the first is knowing what you grow and select non-invasive plants. So be really suspicious of any exotic plants that are sold as fast spreaders, vigorous self-seeders, or drought resistant, because often these are qualities that invasive species have. The next one is definitely use wildflower seed mixes with caution. A lot of times these mixes, we have found invasive seeds in them. You're better off just making your own plant mix or your own wildflower mix. The next one is helping us spread the word, not the weeds. So encouraging your neighbors, your friends, fellow gardeners about the PlantWise program and encouraging them to grow an invasive-free garden. And the last one is definitely buyer beware. So we still do find plants sold in garden stores, at City Saturdays, at plant exchanges. So I'm just going to quickly walk through some of our resources we have for you so that you can educate yourself on some of the top species we still see for sale. So next slide, please. So we have the Grow Me Instead brochure goes through the top 26 invasive plants that, like I said, are still found for sale. And it gives you alternatives to look at. So it's a really handy tool to have as a gardener. There is an app you can put on your phone. These are available online, or if you wanted a hard copy, by all means, flick me an email at the end of this webinar and we can get one into your hands, which is really great. So that's our PlantWise program. We'll just do the next slide here, Rachel. The next part is invasive plant control and disposal. So next to prevention, the next best tool is definitely managing the invasive plants that we have. So there's many ways to manage and eradicate invasive plants. And it's best to choose a species appropriate control method. So knowing what species you have on your property is the first step. You want to definitely check for any underlying conditions such as bare soil or compact soil that may lead to spread. So take measures to keep your soil healthy and replace invasive plants with a diverse range of non-invasive plants. When it comes to disposal, and this is where some of the composting comes into play, you want to deadhead and properly dispose of invasive plant seeds before they go to flower or to seed. If you are joining us from the RDCK or RDKB, all of our landfills do accept invasive plants for free if they come in clear bags. So that's our overall recommendation. By all means, if you're getting to these plants before they go to seed or flower, there is the chance of composting them on site. We just don't recommend you putting it in compost that you're going to be putting into your garden bed, because often it's not going to get hot enough and kill the seeds, and they're still going to be viable. The other important thing is keeping your soil healthy, and that's why we're running this webinar. Is we want to encourage healthy soil. We want to try to keep green waste out of landfills. So at this point, I would like to hand it over to our guest speaker, Rachel Rusin. So we can do the next slide there. So we're really excited to have Rachel join us today. She has a master's degree in land and water systems from UBC, and she brings over 10 years of experience coordinating environmental and agricultural programs. Her technical background includes soil science, agricultural soil management, watershed management, and climate change impacts. Currently, she's the lead coordinator for the Kootenay and Boundary Farm Advisor Program and an environmental farm plan advisor for BC. We look forward to having Rachel guide us through the basics of composting today. So before I hand it over to Rachel, I see in the chat box people are asking some questions. We're going to have Rachel go through her presentation, and at the end we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes for a Q&A. So hold on tight, definitely type them in as they come through, and we'll save the questions to the very end. So I'm just going to turn it over to Rachel here.
Thanks, Lori. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us and for your interest in composting. Sorry, I'm just starting my video so you can see that I'm a human, not a robot. We are not robots because technology has been an interesting voyage for both of us during this webinar experience. Just to add to what Lori said about my introduction, which was great. Thank you so much, Lori. I just want to put out like a disclaimer out front that I'm not a composting expert. I'm a passionate composter. I have real life experience. I live in Rossland and I've been composting here for about 15 years. And I've done some informal composting seminars before, but by no means am I a compost scientist. The intent of this compost webinar is to just give everyone some basic information and tools about the key elements of what composting is. This presentation is not about industrial composting and, like Lori mentioned, hot composting and how we're going to be able to compost everything in the world. This is just about basic kitchen waste and yard waste and how we can keep a healthy, functioning, like typical compost going. I'm also very opinionated, and my opinions are based on experience, not all on scientific evidence. So that's my disclaimer there. And yeah, I think I just wanted to set everybody up for the type of information that we're going to be covering today. And just for sometimes people watch these webinars that are from outside of the Kootenay region, and just so everyone knows about our climate, this is the Kootenays. I live in Rossland, where you get a lot of snow in the winter, and we get really hot summers, and we have really exciting spring and fall seasons on either side. So that's the context for the environment in which we'll be talking about composting today. So I'll be covering principles about why we should even compost to begin with. Those include environmental reasons and soil health reasons. What is compost? And we'll be covering the science of composting there. The actual nuts and bolts of composting. We'll be giving you some real neighborhood examples that include some videos. I'll talk quickly about some gimmicks out there. And we'll cover some frequently asked questions such as winter composting, how to deal with wildlife, and when is my compost ready? So why should we compost anyways? Before I jump into the most exciting part, which is that it's good for our plants, and I'm also an avid gardener, I think the biggest reason I actually compost is to just decrease the amount of waste that I'm putting into the landfill. So almost half of the waste we put in the landfill could actually be composted. In this pie chart, it indicates that 40% are organic materials, 42% are recyclable, and 18% are others. This graph here breaks it down even more, what those organic materials could include. In this chart, it says up to 50% of our waste could be composted. And that is, around 20% is stuff like kitchen waste. And then we have recyclables, wood waste, and actually my video thing's in front of my thing, so I can't actually read my slide. There we go. And the impact of that organic waste on our environment leads to pollution of the surrounding soil, air, and water, climate change impacts, and health hazards to humans and animals. And I'm going to elaborate on those a little bit more just so that we have extra reason to compost. So when we put that organic waste in the landfill, it's often compacted because there's little room in landfills left to accept our megawatts of trash that we send daily to the landfill. So these compactors are running over our trash daily, and that trash are usually in plastic bags. And so there's a lack of oxygen. And this type of decomposition in an oxygen-free environment actually leads to methane coming out of the landfill. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas emission. Furthermore, the heat generated by those bacteria working in an oxygen-free environment can lead to actual combustion. We can have fires in our landfill due to the heat generated by those microbes decomposing that wet material. Leachate can actually be secreted from the decomposition of those wet materials in the landfill, and that can contaminate water sources and soil and things like this. And methane is actually 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide in the environment, and 25% of global warming is caused by methane emissions. So the very act of just sending your green waste to the landfill is contributing to climate change. And I think that that's a very profound thing to understand, that we're not just sending more garbage to the landfill. We're actually creating greenhouse gas emissions by taking a renewable resource that's created by photosynthesis, water, and soil, and turning it into actually something that's a pollutant. So with composting, we can turn the pollution into the solution. And organic matter, like composting itself, turns our organic waste into organic matter. And organic matter can have profound positive impacts on our environment. This is a terrific photo. It's taken from the Soil Health Institute. They do great work on soil science across North America. And it compares the exact same type of soil that has higher organic matter on the left and little organic matter on the right. These two plots are mere meters away from each other. And we can see that the soil on the left is browner. Plant roots can probably get through it easier, whereas the soil on the right with less organic matter, the plants might have less chance of penetrating through that soil. Actually, that soil on the right is really favorite habitat for invasive species. And some quick soil science for you there. I think that most of us don't realize that typical soil in the Kootenay region, or actually in North America, this is very generalized, actually only has about 5% organic matter. 45% of our soil is made up of minerals, 25% is air, 25% is water, and like I said, 5% is organic matter. So if we can increase that organic matter more, we can do lots of good things for our soil. And some of those include increasing our soil function. So many people think, oh, compost is just good for my plants. Well, it is good for your plants, but so much more. So organic matter provides nutrients and habitat for soil microorganisms. It increases the water holding capacity and water infiltration of your soil, and increases the ability of the soil to hold on to nutrients. And it also binds soil particles into aggregates that improve soil texture. So think about chocolate cake. We want our soil to be like chocolate cake, so it can be all squishy and gooey and things like this. I always like to give the example, if we can just visualize for a second, a heavy rainfall event. And with climate change, we're all experiencing more intense sporadic rainfall events. And if we can see that soil on the top, how do you think that reacts compared to the soil on the bottom to a flash rainstorm? That soil on the top has the ability to absorb that water like a sponge. The soil on the bottom, it probably has very little ability to absorb water quickly. And that water tends to sheet off that soil and lead to erosion. And that water basically just ends up in our stormwater systems. And here's a nice fact for us today, that each 1% increase in organic matter helps soil hold 20,000 gallons more of water per acre. So there's just a fun little fact that if we can increase that 5% organic matter, we're actually doing heaps for our backyards, our gardens, our community, by being able to hold on to water longer and also make that water available for our plants. So Thank you for listening to my reasons why we should compost. And, I think sometimes when we do things, it's always good to remember like our rationale behind doing these things. That might actually motivate us more to truck out our kitchen waste back to our compost every morning. So now I'm going to talk about what the actual process of composting is. And like I said, I'm not covering really like what I'd call advanced composting, where we're getting our compost up to a certain amount of degrees so we can kill pathogens and invasive weed seeds. I'm really going to be covering basic biology here and looking at how materials break down. So composting is a natural biological process that's carried out under controlled aerobic conditions, which means they require oxygen. The antithesis to this would be, or the opposite, I guess, is anaerobic. Anaerobic has no oxygen. So we are talking about composting with oxygen. In this process, various microorganisms, including bacteria and fungi, break down organic matter into simpler substances. So we are relying on the soil food web to break down our kitchen waste and garden waste and other scraps for us. So in the top right here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, you have some large organisms in the soil. Those include stuff like worms, beetles, mites, centipedes, and they are the shredders, and they're the ones who do the heavy lifting in our compost, and they chew up the bigger material into smaller material. And then we have things like the bacteria and the fungi and the actinomycetes that actually, that's a type of bacteria that break down that material into even smaller things. And it's the bacteria that generate the heat associated with composting. So the larger organisms break down the first step, and then the bacteria and the fungi, they do the work at the end on the smaller pieces. And an interesting fact as well is this bacteria here, the actinomycetes, that bacteria is the smell of soil. So when you have that fresh smell of soil, you're actually smelling that bacteria doing the good work. So now I'm going to talk about how we're actually going to backyard compost, the actual nuts and bolts of getting started and your key ingredients to feed those bacteria to break down that material for you and make delicious organic matter for your garden. You need 4 key ingredients to have a healthy compost: carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and water. I'm going to elaborate on all 4 of these key ingredients. Interestingly enough, this isn't much different than a human. I need those ingredients to function as a human. So nitrogen and carbon materials, I feel this is like what is the most intimidating portion of composting that kind of trips people up, or they always want to know more about this. So I just want to kind of dispel some myths and put you at ease about how to distinguish these 2 types of materials, and also to not get too nitty-gritty or scientific about how you incorporate them into your compost. For the nitrogen materials, you can think of these as materials that are soft, fresh, or wet, like kitchen waste. It's a very broad tip, and there's a lot of exceptions to this, but as general, that rule will generally work for you. Nitrogen is an important element in amino acids and proteins, and is a vital protein source for the compost microbes, and that's why we need it in our compost. What it does in our compost is it helps speed up the process of decomposition. It brings the heat. It's like the sugar for the microorganisms. If you have too much nitrogen, you could end up with a sloppy compost or the smell of ammonia and a bad odor. That's when you get that under your kitchen sink. If you left it under your kitchen sink for 2 weeks with no carbon material, you get that ammonia, that bad, yucky smell. And that's what happens when you only have nitrogen material in your compost. Carbon material is the opposite, sort of in an easy to remember tip, and that's materials that are hard and dry, such as yard waste and paper. And they play a very important role in the compost as well, because they're a source of energy for the microorganisms. They're the basic building blocks of the microbe's cellular structure. If you have too much carbon, you're just going to have a cooler, slower decomposition process. I would say it's less, if you're worried about smell, odor, and wildlife attractants, you're safer to err on the side of more carbon. You will only end up with a slower compost, but it will not be a manky mess. In terms of the ratios of these ingredients in your compost, I really don't want to tell you a number. The science says you want a ratio of 30 to 1, 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. But there's a trick there, that a lot of the nitrogen ingredients already have carbon in them. So that it kind of confuses people when they're trying to figure out these ratios. In general, I like to do about a 3-part carbon to a 1-part nitrogen ratio, or 50-50 in the middle of summer. Basically, you need to play around. You can Google this till the cows come home about your ratios. I just don't want you to get hung up. Try to put at least equal parts. If you're worried, put more carbon. And here's some typical ingredients involved in greens and browns. So greens, everything from the kitchen. Tea bags, grass cuttings, vegetable peelings, salad leaves, and fruit scraps. Coffee grounds, old flowers, green plants, and leaves. So anything that's green, consider, obviously a green material. It's interesting because with the greens, some of those turn to brown. So fresh grass clippings are nitrogen. Old, dried up, dead grass clippings are carbon. For the brown material, cardboard, egg boxes, egg shells, paper, dried leaves, twigs and branches, sawdust and straw, and nuts. And brown materials are the one thing that we sort of have to manage through the season, because during certain times we have more or less. So in the fall, it's a great time to get your hands on brown materials. I stockpile brown materials, but in the summer, it can be harder to come by brown materials. So this is where you get a little crafty. I really rely on egg cartons, toilet paper rolls. I line my box of my compost under my kitchen sink with brown paper. So you're really looking to find ways to incorporate that brown into your garden or into your compost throughout the season. The next key element is water. And we have plenty of rain in the spring and the fall in the Kootenays. So I don't think you have to worry about watering your compost in the spring or the fall. Just don't forget that your compost can dry out in the summertime. So you don't want a soaking wet compost, but you want it to be moist. So it's not uncommon to have to water your compost in July and August, maybe once every 2 weeks. Give it a good soak. Remember, those soil microbes, like us, need water in order to function. And last of the 4 ingredients, and probably what I would say the most important ingredient for composting, is oxygen. We often think we have to isolate the compost apart from Mother Nature for it to do its thing, but it needs oxygen in order for those soil microbes to function and to be present in our compost. And the compost picture on the right, you'll notice there's some sticks down below. And things like sticks, straw, plant stalks, egg cartons, they're really great because they help not make the compost too compacted. And they naturally help make pore spaces within the compost itself. So you really want to make sure your compost is well aerated. Open air composts are fantastic. And turn your compost once in a while to make sure that oxygen is getting to the bottom of the compost. That way your soil microbes have all the ingredients they need to break down that kitchen waste into healthy organic matter for your garden. So I've now covered why we should compost, the key ingredients to making a healthy compost, and now I'm going to give some examples about people who are currently composting in Rossland. I'm going to be giving 4 examples. I'm going to show you some photos from my compost. I'm going to do some short interviews with through video with 2 composters, and then show you some worm composting. So this is my compost. I am a lazy composter. Oh my gosh, I only have a 1-bin system that I will upgrade to a 2-bin system or 3-bin system. You've heard it now. But basically my method is that I empty my compost twice a year, spring and fall. This photo right here is from the spring. I take everything off the top, I shovel out the bottom, and I incorporate it into my garden. And you can see all my egg cartons and sticks and everything there. And I really like this because it's loosely held together compost that I can take apart and put back together whenever I need to harvest my black gold. This is a photo of my previous house. This photo is from the springtime, and you can see I'm doing exactly the same thing. I had limited space, so I just had a 1-bin system. In the spring, I took everything out and I shoveled out the bottom black gold and I incorporated that into my garden boxes. You'll notice the pile in the middle is full of carbon material. There's sticks, undecomposed stuff, and dry leaves. That's because I loaded my compost up in the fall with some carbon-rich materials, knowing that I'd be incorporating green waste through the winter. This is undecomposed, so I'm going to put that back into my compost to decompose throughout the summer. And these are those garden beds just 3 weeks later, already sprouting fresh salad greens. This is a shovelful I took out of my compost just 3 weeks ago. It didn't look like it was doing anything, my compost, but I got in there, and sure enough, as soon as you start mucking about in the middle of that compost, you realize that it is teeming with microbes. And I'd like to let everybody here know today that you do not have to bring bugs to your compost. If you build it, they will come. It's absolutely amazing. And that's one other reason why it's nice to not put a bottom on your compost, because those soil microorganisms can just come up from the earth itself. They can sniff out that carbon and nitrogen as a food source, and they will come. One interesting thing is they won't really transplant into your garden. So if you bring these worms over to your garden, they don't really seem to stick around. It seems like these are composting specific worms. And construction. I don't get too tricky with construction. These are inner tube tires from our bike store. You get those for free. I got the pallets from our pet food store for free. And I just, I lightly put this compost together because I need to be able to take it apart to mix my compost, to harvest the black gold. And also, there's no such thing as a wildlife-proof compost. You know, we want to keep the dogs and the vermin and the bears out to our best ability. But if you have a smelly, unhealthy compost, wildlife will find a way if it's really smelly. So you want to keep an odorless, contained compost. And I just also wanted to show participants what's in my weekly compost. So this was just from a few days ago. This is my compost bin on the right. And this is another #1 trick I have for everybody today. Line your compost bucket under your sink with some brown paper or egg cartons or toilet paper rolls. And that will kind of like soak up some of the water from your green waste. When you dump your compost into your compost pile, put that brown paper in the compost pile. And this helps keep your kitchen compost waste, like your bucket, clean. You don't end up with that manky compost bucket. It keeps it less odor, I don't know, it just keeps it cleaner. So always line your, well, don't always, it's your preference, but I suggest lining your under the sink compost bucket with some brown paper, carbon material, and then you can see the waste that I'm getting rid of. I have citrus, corn cobs, rotten apples, and that will all go into my compost pile. And this is a photo of my home garden right now. Lazy composting. I actually just put leaves right into the pathways to decrease as a weed suppressor. So you don't always even have to compost all your organics in a compost pile. You can just lay them on the ground. In this case, as a weed suppressor between your garden beds, and they will just naturally decompose as the season goes along. And I have to say, this was a good experiment. I had these leaves 4 feet deep in the fall, and with the snow, they compressed all the way down. I peeled the leaves off my garden beds, and I had weed-free aisles the whole growing season. So now I'd like to show you a video from Councillor Kirk Lewis. He's an avid composter in Rossland.
I'm Kirk, and this is my compost. I've been composting for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years now. And what else to say? It's really quite simple. I thought it was going to be more of a challenge, but Rachel helped me out with the process and what to put in, and we made this. The neighbors tend to use this and share the compost with us. We don't have a lot piling up because the chickens tend to eat it and poop in it and make it nice and rich. At the beginning of the season, these 2 bins were full and have since decomposed down to very little. We haven't actually taken any soil out yet. And yeah, it's been very easy. This represents about 2/3 of our previous pre-compost waste going into this now.
Wow. So how often do you mix and turn this?
Every couple months when I remember. Not very often.
Okay.
Sometimes it tends to look pretty packed on the top.
I guess you have some helpers here.
They have helpers. Yeah. They do tend to pack it down some.
All right.
So you'll get quite a sheen on the top, and I'll turn it over.
You want to give us a stir there, Dirk?
Yeah, just with a little shovel. Turn it over and...
Wow, that looks like it's,
doesn't,
with little effort, you have managed to get some great soil activity there. That's really decomposed. In regards to like the brown stuff versus the green stuff, do you try to get some carbon in there, some like of the brown things to mitigate wildlife being attracted?
We do, not a ton. Periodically I'll take the hay from the chickens and put it in there.
Yeah.
As brown. There's a huge bump in brown when we do the leaves in the fall. We collect them and kind of, we put it on the ground and the chickens shred it like crazy. Fill the compost with it and then cover our gardens. And at the spring, we'll take it out of the gardens, put it in the compost, chickens shred it up. Other than that, we don't really focus too much on greens and browns. Just whatever comes out of the kitchen goes in there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Dirk. It looks like you have some great soil to add to your garden. And once again, these bins were full at the start of the summer season, and they just naturally decompose down with the soil microorganisms. And now we have some black gold. Thank you, Dirk.
This is the one I'm digging right now. And so I'm digging from this and adding it back into my garden. And this is the one that's been cooking all summer. It's almost ready to start digging. So what we have is building, digging, and cooking. The benefits of a 3-bin compost system. Now in my compost system that I'm building right now, you can see that everything is still pretty much looks like what it started out as. So, and I put everything in here, everything, of course, compostable things. So I've got a little bit of paper in here. That's a good carbon source. Some dried out pea things, another good carbon source. And my favorite thing to add, along with my kitchen scraps for nitrogen source, of course, is coffee grounds. I pick coffee grounds up from our local coffee shop, and I integrate these into the one that's cooking. What I find coffee does, it's really great. One, bears don't like the taste of it, and I think it keeps them awake. They don't have to eat it, and it actually, I think the best thing is that it's like a superheater for my compost. So when I add coffee grounds, I'll dig them in a little bit, and I'll show you what it does. If I open this up a little bit,
steamy.
you can see, and if you put your hand in there, it's actually hot.
No, we can see the steam.
The nice thing about adding coffee grounds, especially in the wintertime, is that it keeps your compost warm, which means you can dig it and toss it, keep that air and oxygen and water in there, and your compost will compost all the way through the winter, which means in the spring, chances are good, with a little bit of time, this one will be ready to dig next spring, and I'll be able to add it right into my vegetable garden. I compost because it helps me keep all this stuff out of the landfill. I probably take 15 gallons of coffee grounds from the coffee shop, going to the landfill, but coming here instead. And then when I transfer it over here, the result is really good food to eat.
Beautiful.
I rarely buy any compost any longer, like bagged compost from grocery stores. Mostly I just make my compost from my yard.
And Anne, I'm just going to look at this soil here is about ready to go into the garden. And I think I just want to point out to people that you can see there's still a lot of undecomposed material in there, and you don't need to screen this or anything. You just put it in there, it becomes habitat for microorganisms. And
there is big stuff when you go to dig and you don't want to add it, just throw it in the other compost bin.
In our other bin.
And it'll keep going.
Yeah, I think we had a lot of worm activity in here before. Oh yeah, there they are.
And the worms will come on their own. I've never added worms to this. They just move in. And during the hot stage, the worms won't be in your compost. Once the compost is mostly broken down, the worms will move in and do the last of the composting. At that point, your compost is going to be cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Anne. That's been a wonderful tour.
Meant to introduce Anne better there, so sorry, Anne, that we just jumped right into yours. I consider Anne sort of like my composting mentor. Anne is really, she's a super avid gardener, and so she's actively trying to get compost into her garden. With her 3-bin system there, she is always turning and crunching and really trying to make as much compost as she possibly can. Hence, for that reason, she collects the coffee grounds from her local coffee shop to augment the amount of material that she's putting into her compost. She also chops up her waste smaller so that the decomposition process is quicker, and also has a nice hot compost, as you can see from that steam. So thank you, Anne, for sharing that. I'd say Dirk and I are more on the lazy end of composting. Things take a little longer to break down, but they eventually do, and we can put that in our garden. I'm also going to be talking about when that compost is ready to put in your garden, and also about worm composting if nobody wants to attempt this outside. But I just quickly, this is where I get opinionated, the gimmicks. So use the chat box, and can anybody tell me what could possibly be wrong with these 2 plastic compost bins? Lori's going to review the answers. I'll give everyone 15 seconds. Oh yeah, what could possibly be wrong with these compost bins that you can buy at Canadian Tire or wherever?
Okay, so we have some answers coming through here. A lot of people are saying no air, that it's a bear toy, difficult to distribute or stir, and that they break easily.
Fantastic. Those are great reasons, and you guys nailed it. Number 1 being lack of oxygen. There is just not enough ways for air to get in here. Furthermore, water. They have lids on them. You would actually have to go in and water these. Rain just can't get into them. And they're just not big enough. Like, how are you going to mix it, get your carbon materials in there? What often ends up happening with these is that they just turn into a stinky, manky mess because you just can't get enough carbon material in there, and they just don't have enough oxygen. Bears have become habituated in some circumstances to recognize these things, and they knock them over, and they just invariably end up in the landfill. I just laughed when I saw this photo the other day walking to Dirk's house to take that composting video, because here we have one of those twirly things, but it's beside a pile of carbon material. That carbon material is in a terrific compost the way that it's in that the wire there, but it doesn't have any nitrogen materials, which are likely in the twirly thing. And the brown stuff's not in the twirly thing because it's not big enough. That thing, in my opinion, is probably bound for the landfill in 1 to 2 years. So I'm sorry if anybody here is a salesperson for these gimmicks. I have yet to see them be successful. You don't need fancy toys in order to compost. If you buy them, you're likely just contributing to the junk that goes to the landfill daily, which is what we're trying to avoid. So I've covered the basics of what you need to compost, giving you a couple of real-world examples of those who compost. And I'll cover some frequently asked questions that might be what's coming up in the chat box right now. So can I compost in the winter? Wildlife? When is my compost ready and what do I do with it? And how do I get started? So you're probably all going to laugh at the next picture. This is a picture of my boyfriend trucking the compost out on Christmas Day. I don't actually advise doing this if you want to get your family on board with composting. But yes, I do compost all winter, and most people that I know do compost in the winter. The biggest barrier seems to be getting the compost out to the compost pile in the winter. What happens in the winter is your microorganisms just go dormant. They just stop decomposing material. Unless you're Anne and you work really hard to actually keep a warm compost through the winter time. I'm not that advanced, but I do put my kitchen waste in my compost all winter long. I just dig a hole in the snow, put it in there, and the freeze-thaw cycles actually help break down the cellular structure of your vegetable materials. So in the spring, decomposition happens really fast. You just have to make sure that in the springtime, you're ready with some brown material to kind of balance out all that nitrogen you've been putting in there all winter long. Unlike my partner here, who's diligently taking out the compost in his robe, the number one trick I can offer you is in the winter, put your compost near your front door before you go outside to do an outdoor activity like cross-country skiing or snowshoeing. And when you come back, you already have your Gore-Tex pants and your winter boots on. That's a better time to take the compost out to your garden. Wildlife attractants. Here I'm talking about rats and bears and dogs and all those things we don't want in our compost. There's no such thing as a bear-proof compost. Please, nobody try to build some kind of bunker that will keep a bear out. It will not happen. If your compost stinks, a bear will get in no matter what. There is only such thing as a healthy compost. And by a healthy compost, I mean a compost that smells like soil, not that smells like disgusting, manky, rotting food. This chart on the right-hand side is what Dirk has in his compost area as a reminder for how to compost in bear country. In Rossland, we are very busy with bears in the spring and the fall, and that's a time to be especially vigilant with these rules. So some of the top things he has on his rule thing are to mix the greens and browns at a 50-50 ratio. If you have fragrant components in your compost, like rotting stuff, just make sure you bury them deep in the compost pile. Cover your compost pile with a layer of leaves or straw. If you don't have any of that around, sprinkle some soil on top. I like this tip. Try doing your composting in the middle of the day when the bears are less likely to be tromping near your bear or your compost. I'm not going to go over our list of greens and browns, but on the bottom right-hand side, you'll see the no-no-nos. So definitely do not include meat, fish, bones, eggs, grains, rice, pasta, dairy, grease or oil, or feces. You know, like I said, we are not talking about industrial hot composting here. You can compost some of those things if you had a really bumping hot system with a thermometer and you knew it got to such and such degree. We're not talking about that today. Please leave all of those items out of your compost, and that will definitely decrease the amount of wildlife that are attracted to your compost pile. And I thought I'd throw in some additional tips for composting in bear country, just because I know that most of us do live in bear corridors. So when it's bear season, like the spring and the fall, just be extra vigilant during these times. Dump your compost midday. Empty your compost bin frequently so it doesn't get super manky and stinky. I would suggest twice a week. Bury your kitchen waste into your compost pile when you empty it. If you're like really in the dark in the woods and you're really worried about bears, put electric fencing around your compost pile or indoor compost your kitchen waste with a worm composting system. Avoid building your compost right in the middle of an existing wildlife corridor. A lot of us people who live in mountain towns have wildlife corridors in our backyards. Avoid putting the compost in that area. And if you're very worried about attracting animals, like I said, carbon materials, it will slow down the decomposition of your material, but you're erring on the side of caution in terms of odor. And I do like to remind people that if your compost does become an attractant, it's okay to stop composting for a while. Animals have great memories, so it's hard to shake an animal of habit. You can try again in a couple of months when the animal forgets that your compost is there. But it's very common that if a bear finds your compost or is attracted to it once, it might repeat coming back to it and back to it again just because it becomes part of their regular circuit. And here we have Lori's family who do worm composting inside. Now, as an introduction to this, I know that some people aren't, I don't think worm composting is supposed to be very challenging. I know some people have maybe had systems that aren't that effective, but the Rogers family and the Franklin family have been very successful with their worm compost. They outdoor compost their yard waste, but they indoor compost their kitchen waste.
I'm Elsie. We live in British Columbia, Rossland, and these are two of our worms from our worm farm. And this is my dad, Isaac, who is going to tell you about a little bit about our worm farm. So what is a worm farm and how does it work?
Well, this is a vertical flow worm farm system. You put a feedstock in the top. We use the worms called red wigglers. This thing is absolutely crawling with worms. You can see them all in there. And we simply put a feedstock on the top and we collect very nutrient rich worm castings out the bottom. The feedstock is mainly our food scraps from our house mixed with wood chips or straw, whatever carbon you need or whatever carbon you have readily access to. We're looking at a ratio of 25 to 35 carbon to nitrogen ratio, so that would be 25 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, or 35 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And that means it keeps it at a good consistent temperature and keeps the worms all happy. Happy worms make for great worm castings.
So, what's so good about a worm farm?
Well, this means that we can compost our food scraps 12 months a year. Living in the Canadian climate, that is that's hard to do unless you have an indoor composter.
And does it stink?
No, and it doesn't have any odor.
Awesome. Okay, sign us off, Els.
I hope you had a great day watching this video. Bye-bye. My name's Elsie.
So thank you, Frank Home and Rogers family, for sharing your worm composting experiences with us. I'm going to move right along because I know we only have 5 minutes left and there's still lots of exciting content to cover. So when is my compost done? When do I know when I can put it in my garden? This photo here is a picture of my own compost when I think I'm pretty much ready to put it in there. Basically, no, you don't need to screen your compost. You can throw it in there when it's pretty much almost decomposed. If you have large chunks, that's totally fine to put in your garden. As you can see in this photo, there's lots of large pieces left. That just means you incorporate more habitat for soil microorganisms into your garden boxes, and they will eventually decompose. In this picture, same thing, soil on the left, just from my compost. You can see you have avocado pits and avocado peels and fruit pits. That's okay to put in your garden. The photo on the right is the soil in my garden, and you can see there's little eggshells and apricot pits and such like that, and that's totally fine to be in your soil. You don't need a perfectly sifted soil. Your soil microorganisms will appreciate that there's these pieces left in there, and it will actually help with your soil aeration and decrease compaction. And one last video. This is a profile of my compost from the other day.
I haven't really turned my compost since the spring when I took all the soil out from the bottom, but I took this opportunity to turn it. You can see all the little bugs are scurrying about. They got uncovered here, but you kind of see how the layering, the less decomposed stuff is on the top. And as we go down below, we have some soil that we can now add to the garden. This soil here, this compost, I would be okay with adding that to my garden. I know it's not fully decomposed, but if I pick out some of the big lumps, I think that this is pretty good to go in there. And you can see we have all the shredders, the centipedes, the millipedes, the worms. They do the heavy work at getting all the organic matter crunched down into smaller bits so that then the fungi and the bacteria can break it down even smaller. But you can see that wall of black gold that's just been decomposing all summer there, and some of the less decomposed stuff on top. And there's all my egg cartons.
Okay, I think we're good there. And just, so you guys are all educated now on, am I unmuted? Yes, I am unmuted, sorry. You've got all the information you need now to dive into composting. How do you get started? I thought I wanted to give you like 4-step process to get into composting. So build an enclosure. I recommend pallets, or on the right, you can see there's a photo with some wire mesh. Add 2 buckets of any soil you have, 1 to 2 big bags of carbon, 1 to 2 kitchen containers of kitchen scraps, water it, mix, and away you go, and just start building that. And I have to say the fall is a great time to start composting because you're gonna have so much carbon material to work with. So it's as good a time as ever to get started. As and then as a plug for the Invasive Species Society, of course, we don't want to be composting any invasive species that you don't know how they propagate on their own. So what we're really trying to avoid is composting weed stock, like seeds that are just going to sit in your compost and not die. You don't want to be spreading that compost around that could have invasive weed seeds in it. Or like particles of rootstock that then spread when you put into your garden. So like Lori said in the beginning, just avoid putting those invasive species into your compost, and away you go. And I have a picture of a couple compost examples here. The wire one works really well. It's just harder to get into, but you could just untie the wire mesh and your compost is right there. And the one on the left, just a typical pallet compost. So on behalf of all the soil microorganisms out there, we thank you very much for your attention today. I know it's been a whirlwind into the composting basics, but we hope that we have given you enough information to get started, and we look forward to answering your questions as they come in.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. So just so you guys know, Rachel and I are sitting in the same room, so let us know when we're both unmuted if you can't hear us. We've had lots of questions come in. I know that we are at our 1 o'clock mark, so if you need to go, we understand. We'll stick around for about 10 to 15 minutes to try to get to all of the questions. So one question came in around, that was for me, around my advice about deadheading things. Someone's like, what's deadheading? It's not listening to Jerry Garcia. It is when you go around and you cut the flower and seed pods off of any invasive plants that spread through seed. So a lot of invasive seeds have a really long seed bank. So this is a way of, it won't eradicate your existing infestation, but it will definitely help stop a new infestation. And then someone had a question around Japanese knotweed. Yeah, that's not one you want to cut or deadhead because it does spread. 1/7 of a gram of knotweed can start a new infestation. So in our post email we're going to send out, if you are dealing with knotweed on your property, there is going to be some information for landowners in that. So definitely check your inbox for that. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rachel. I'll get some questions for you. So some people were wondering about like the chemicals in like the ink on paper. Are we concerned about any of that, Rachel, about ink on paper? Can that be composted?
Hi, everybody. Nope, you don't have to be worried. Don't quote me on this, but I think there's a law now that says that all ink has to be soy-based. So you're good to go. It's actually made from organic materials, that ink. And so give her, put all the print material in there you want. I would avoid anything glossy. I think that kind of speaks for itself. It's covered in some type of plastic stuff, but regular newspaper with colored ink is totally fine.
Okay, great. And then we had some questions around coffee. People are wondering, how much, is there too much coffee? How often should I put coffee in? Does it really help stop animals? So if you can address coffee grounds, some advice around that.
You can put as much coffee grounds in there as you can drink. That's for absolute sure. And in that video with Anne, she collects like 4 huge buckets per week from her local coffee shop to incorporate into her compost because she thinks it helps. It's kind of like a nitrogen source, so it helps increase the heat. It helps accelerate the rate of decomposition. And so you saw the size of her compost bins. She's putting in like 4 big pails a week into one compost bin. And she's having no problems at all. And like Anne said, she thinks it mitigates the wildlife attractants because it really doesn't have a stinky odor at all. So your compost can handle a lot of coffee grounds.
Okay, and another question around chemicals. What about chemicals from any of the wood from the pallets? Is that a concern?
No, I mean, I don't think I mean, like, once again, don't quote me. I don't think pellets are heavily treated with anything. So I think you're fine. Like, I think that there's like we have to remember what we're doing with this end compost product. We're not eating the compost. We are not ingesting as humans this compost. It's just going into our gardens or our lawns or top dressing our favorite tree. It's the plants that are using this, and it's absolutely incredible the power of soil microorganisms to actually filter out chemicals. Soil has an incredible ability to filter out like minute amounts of chemicals. By no means am I saying that it's like a chemical sponge, but I think you don't have to worry about any types of paint that would be on a pallet.
Okay. And then sorry, I just got to find the next question here. Bear with me. Okay, some other two questions about ingredients. So about the green versus brown. So they're wondering, are used black tea leaves green or brown?
Ooh, that's like I said, it's no, they're wet. Let's go with green. But if you dried them out in the sun, then they'd be brown.
Okay. And the second part of that is old, dry, unfinished compost brown.
Old, dry, unfinished compost. Sure, yeah, let's go with brown. But I think the point that I just wanted to remind people not to like agonize over the difference between green and brown. We have some obvious greens, like everything under our kitchen sink. Let's call that green because it's sloppy and wet. And then everything that's dead and dry that we get from the outside, plus paper products, brown. And we want to kind of aim for a 50-50 ratio.
Okay. And Rach, you're going to love this question because I know you're passionate about agriculture. So how to guarantee a good compost quality for agriculture? And they have in brackets use of limestone, for example.
I'm not sure. Yeah, like the use of limestone, I guess I'm just like a little confused by the question. Like, I don't know if they're talking about buying compost. I mean, any compost that you make out of carbon and nitrogen is going to be phenomenal for any agricultural soil. The pH of compost is low. So often in a garden, you may want to add lime to increase the pH of your soil. The very act of composting itself actually tends to decrease the pH of your soil. So if you are adding compost annually, you might want to get an at-home pH soil test kit or just automatically add lime every season to your soil.
Okay, and we had a couple folks ask about citrus peels, if they're too acidic, if it causes a problem, or is there having no limit for citrus okay?
No limit for citrus. Put it all in, even if you're an orangutan.
Okay, so that's a myth. All right. Have you tried any type of accelerator for compost? I have used, so they put some sort of combination of a can of beer, a can of Coke, and ounces of bleach, and quite a bit of water, and they thought that it worked. Have you ever heard of any sort of accelerator for compost?
No, that sounds quite creative though. I would never put bleach in my compost because soil microorganisms wouldn't like bleach. The best accelerator I can think of for composting is two things. One, make sure you chop up everything really small, which Anne does, and I don't, because I'm a lazy composter and I slow compost. So chop everything up really small and mix your compost often. Make sure you have like enough oxygen and water in there, because if everything is small and aerated, your microorganisms are going to be able to work faster. You know when your compost is working fast if it's warm inside. So that's my tips there.
Okay. And then a question around feces. So we did mention that it's a no-no, but they're just wanting to get clarification if that's around livestock manure as well. So chicken, cow, horse, etc.
Okay, so sorry, yes, I should have clarified. No, it doesn't include animal manures, But people should be aware that with the backyard compost, the reason that people say not to put feces in there is that if you aren't getting your compost super hot and toasty and bringing it up to a temperature that kills pathogens, those pathogens that exist in some feces, like your dog poo or your kitty litter, please don't put your kitty litter in your compost. Those pathogens will still be there. Now, pathogens are not bad for your soil, but the concern comes into play when you could accidentally ingest some of that compost yourself. So let's say you're spreading the compost in the spring and get some in your mouth. Those pathogens can be transported to humans. Not actually sure why, like chicken compost, like chicken manure and cow manure also has pathogens. Maybe it just doesn't have as long a shelf life. I know that we just like to decrease the amount of like household pet feces that go in there specifically for that pathogen concern, and that we aren't killing off those pathogens with typical backyard composting, unless you're really diligent and nerding out and getting that compost super hot and up to a desired temperature.
Okay, our next question is around eggs. People are wondering if they need to break up the eggs, or is it okay just to put the 2 halves in there after they crack an egg?
Fire them in as is. If you're stirring your compost and stuff, they're going to just break up naturally from like the turning of your compost. They also create super habitats for all your microorganisms in there. They really like to be protected under those shells. So I think it helps to just have them free floating in your compost as is.
Okay, so just a few more questions here, Rachel, and then we'll end it. Someone's asking about dead pine needles and wondering if they're safe as brown or are they too acidic?
Dead pine needles. That's a good question. And I didn't really cover things like the acidic needles and stuff. I think it's fine to put them in your compost. They're not going to acidify it too much. I think the biggest concern is actually that they take a really long time to break down. So anything associated with wood, coarse woody debris, it has something called lignin in there. And lignin is something that takes a really long time for soil microorganisms to actually break down. So if you consistently add a lot of pine needles to your compost, what you're going to notice is when you take out your compost in a year and a half, you're going to have a lot of soil, but also a lot of undecomposed pine needles. So, an alternative to that is you might want to start like a slow compost pile that just takes all your pine cones and your needles, and that just kind of sits, it's like a 3-year pile or something like that. But avoid overloading your regular compost with that, because what you'll find, you'll get discouraged because you'll be like, why isn't this stuff decomposing? I know I put a whole bunch of pine cones in my compost a few years ago, and I incorporated them into my garden soil, and I still find them in my garden soil. So I've been avoiding putting those materials in.
Oh, someone was asking about what size 1 to 2 containers of kitchen scraps, the little kitchen caddy size. Not really 100% sure what that question is.
Yeah, as a size estimate, like the typical 4-gallon pail of ice cream you get from the grocery store. That's like a general, I really like that size. I know I showed the one picture of my household compost bin, but that typical 4-gallon ice cream pail is a really nice size to use for your kitchen scraps, because it also stops you from hoarding too much waste under your kitchen sink.
Okay,
so yeah,
I'm sorry.
To elaborate, when we're talking about getting started with your compost, I was thinking of that size. So adding 2 of those size buckets into your starter compost.
Okay, and someone's asking about walnut leaves. Can you compost walnut leaves?
I would say some, but don't overload it. I'm not even familiar too much with the walnut leaf. It's probably acidic, I'm guessing. So I think you could probably add some, but just don't super overload your compost with it, because it will change the dynamics of the entire system. Whenever you add too much of one thing, it can do that. But I would actually Google that before you take my word on it.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to end the Q&A session there, because we're over 15 minutes over our time. So just want to thank everyone for joining us today. Just give a shout out to our funders. So this webinar was possible because of Columbia Basin Trust and the province of BC through their community gaming grant. So thank you so much. And just a reminder to folks to definitely check your inboxes, because we are going to be sending you link to the webinar recording if you wanted to rewatch it or share it with a friend, along with a whole bunch of plant-wise resources, invasive species resources, and as well as some composting resources. So thanks so much.